Vic Brower had lived beside the McAllister place for 31 years, and he had never once been wrong about the weather. This is the story of Ruth McAllister, the sunflowers she planted, and the blizzard that settled every argument anyone in Millhaven, Wyoming had been making for 14 months. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. One November morning, Vic stood at his kitchen window and watched Ruth plant the last row of sunflower seeds along the north fence, a full 3 weeks after Dale's funeral, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The particular unease of a man who sees something he can't explain. She was planting them the way Dale had always planted them, heel to toe spacing. Seeds at a depth Vic knew by instinct was exactly right, moving along the fence line in the gray April cold with Dale's denim jacket on her shoulders and her 2 daughters following behind her, closing the soil with their boots. He watched until she reached the corner post. Then he put his coffee down and went to find Agnes. The arguments had started almost before Dale was in the ground. Dale McAllister had died in November, 14 months before the blizzard, from the kind of sudden thing that gives no warning and leaves the people it leaves behind standing in a kitchen trying to understand how the world reorganized itself without asking permission. He had been 43. He had been in good health. He had gone out to check the south fence after dinner on a Thursday and hadn't come back, and Ruth had found him in the dark with a flashlight, and by the time the ambulance reached the Bighorn Basin Road, the question of what came next had already become the only question that mattered. He had been 43 years old, and the fence was still down in the south pasture, and there were 2 daughters asleep in the house, who did not yet know that the world they were going to wake up to in the morning was a different one. Ruth got through that first winter the way you get through things that have no practice run, by doing the next thing, and then the next one after that, and not looking too far past the end of the day. She kept the cattle fed, and watered through a January that dropped to 22 below, and stayed there for a week. She kept Cora and Lily in school, drove the county road twice a day in conditions that would have kept most people home, packed lunches in the dark before the sun came up. Because it was the thing she had always done, and she needed to keep doing the things she had always done. She paid the bills in the order of their urgency. She did not sleep well. She read Dale's farm journals late at night at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea going cold beside her, because his handwriting was the closest thing she had to hearing his voice, and because the journals were where Dale kept the things he'd figured out, and she needed to know what he'd figured out. Leon Pruitt came to see her in January, 6 weeks after the funeral, with the practiced neutrality of a man who has decided something is available and is making a first approach before anyone else does. He was the county assessor, a compact, careful man of 52, who had been in that office for 9 years and who had, in those 9 years, also assembled 11 parcels across 3 counties through a network of quiet purchases that the county board had never found cause to examine too closely. He had looked at the McAllister place more than once over the years, with the evaluating eye of someone calculating what a property might yield once the current circumstances resolved themselves. He told Ruth that 40 acres was a great deal for one person to manage. He told her the market was favorable at the moment, better than it might be further down the road. He said he knew people who might be interested. Good people, fair offer. He said it gently, with his hat in his hand, the way Leon Pruitt said everything that was not gentle at all. "I'll be in touch if anything changes," Ruth said. She said it at the door, because that was where she had met him, and that was where she intended to leave him. He drove away down the county road, and then, because Millhaven had 340 people, and a feed store, and a post office, and the Lutheran church, and no particular shortage of winter hours, the talking began. Ruth caught it in fragments, a silence that fell when she walked into the feed store, a conversation that changed subject when she came within earshot at the school, a comment from her neighbor Carol Jessup that was meant kindly but landed differently, that it was so hard, and didn't she think it was a lot? And had she thought about what her options were? Ruth told Carol she was fine, and thanked her, and drove home and stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at the weather vane Dale had put up on the barn roof the summer before, a sunflower shape, hand-cut from sheet steel, painted yellow, the petals bent at the tips to catch the wind, until she felt steady again. The consensus, as best she could read it from what reached her indirectly, was that she couldn't manage the place alone, that it was too much land for one woman with 2 children, that Dale would have wanted her to be practical. Nobody said this to her directly. In Millhaven, the hard things travel on the same indirect routes they always have, through the back pew and the counter at Harmon's Feed, and the phone calls that happen after 10 o'clock when the day's business is done. Ruth heard it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the land wouldn't eventually say better. She had the cattle to winter, 2 daughters to keep in school and fed and as steady as she could make them. She had a furnace that needed a part in February, and a truck that needed tires in March, and a feed bill that she paid down slowly, month by month, the way you pay down things, when the income from the operation is meeting the costs but not exceeding them, and you are depending on the spring calves going well. She was not going under. She was not running the place into the ground. She was doing what Dale had done for 16 years before her, which was farming in a county where farming is not easy, and doing it the way he had taught her, which was carefully and without shortcuts, and with the understanding that the land remembers what you do to it. She found Dale's farm journals in the cabinet beside the wood stove. 22 composition books spanning the years from when his father had handed the place to him to the October before he died. She began reading them in February, at the kitchen table after Cora and Lily were in bed, working through them in order the way she felt he would have wanted her to, not skipping to the parts she was curious about, but reading the whole experiment from the beginning. He had noted soil temperatures and frost dates and germination rates. He had noted which years the sunflowers had come in heavy and which years they had struggled, and what the difference between those years appeared to be. He had noted, in a careful hand, with a blue pen, that he replaced at the same hardware store in Thermopolis every spring, the wind directions that gave him trouble, and the fence lines that took the worst of it, and what he had tried over the years to correct for. She began to understand things she had known without knowing she knew. The sunflowers were not ornamental. They had never been ornamental. They were planted the way Dale planted everything, for a reason that he had arrived at through observation and record-keeping over years, and that reason was the north fence and the east run of the barn, where the prevailing winter wind came in hardest, and the way the stalks, left standing through winter, caught the snow and built up a packed wall of insulation between the bitter outside air and the walls that mattered. She found the entry where he had recorded the first winter it worked the way his father had told him it would work. She found the entry where he had measured the temperature differential with a pair of thermometers, one inside the snowpack and one on the exposed east wall, and written down what he found, 14 degrees. She read it twice. Then she went to the window and looked at the barn in the February dark, the weather vane just visible against the winter stars. Turning, she planted the last week of April, the way his journal said to, not the first week when the ground tempted you with a few warm days, but the second week when the soil temperature had actually committed. Cora and Lily planted with her. Lily, who was 8, was in charge of closing the soil with her boot heel after each seed, a job she took seriously enough that she sometimes went back and repressed spots she felt hadn't been adequately tamped. Cora, who was 11 and had Dale's eye for straight lines, walked the fence ahead of Ruth and marked the spacing with a stick, toe to heel the way Dale had done it, the way his father had done it before that. The wind that morning smelled like iron and coming rain, and the particular green cold smell of Wyoming soil opening after a long winter, and Vic Brower watched from his kitchen window and then went to find Agnes, and did not say anything to either of them about it until later. By October, the sunflowers stood 8 feet along the north fence and the east run of the barn. The heads were heavy and golden and slightly past their peak, beginning to nod forward the way sunflowers do at the end of their season, the seeds filling out dark and dense inside the dried petals. Ruth had harvested about 1/3 of the heads for seed saving, the biggest, straightest ones, the ones that had held up best through the summer hail in July, and pressed a portion of the previous year's saved seeds into oil on the hand press Dale had built in the barn, filling 6-pint jars that she lined up on the kitchen windowsill where the afternoon light came through amber and clear, the color of good honey. The jar she'd keep through winter was there now, the others already given away or set aside for the church auction. The weather vane turned above the barn in the October wind, the yellow sunflower petals catching the gusts cleanly, as it had turned through every wind of the past 14 months. Vic had come over in September to help Ruth decide which stalks to take down before winter and which to leave standing. They had walked the fence line together the way Dale and Vic had walked it every fall. And Vic had told her what Dale had told him years ago about the spacing and the depth of the root hold. And Ruth had listened and taken her own notes in the composition book she had started keeping in the spring, her handwriting in blue pen, like Dale's, though rounder where his was angular. Pruitt came back in October. He had revised his offer upward, which he mentioned twice and which Ruth did not find relevant, and he brought a document showing the county's current land valuation. He slid it across the kitchen table the way he slid everything, with the practiced ease of a man who uses paper as a stand-in for argument, who has found that a printed number on county letterhead carries a weight in conversation that the same number spoken aloud does not. Ruth looked at it. The assessed value was 31% below what she and Vic had calculated the land was worth, based on comparable sales in the basin. It was the kind of assessment that would become the foundation of a sale price if she agreed to one, the kind that locked in a number before anyone had a chance to question it. "That's not what this land is worth," Ruth said. "That's the county's current assessment," Pruitt said. "Then the county's assessment is wrong." She slid the paper back across the table. "I'll let you know if anything changes." He left, and this time there was a different quality to how he left, the brisk gathering of papers, the hat put on while still inside, the truck out of the drive before the door had fully closed. Vic heard about the visit from Agnes, who had heard it from Carol Jessup, and came over the following Saturday to tell Ruth what people were saying now, that she was being stubborn, that someone needed to get through to her before she made things worse than they had to be. Ruth poured him coffee and listened, and then said, "Vic, do you know why Dale planted the sunflowers along the north fence?" Vic looked at his coffee for a moment. "He said it was the right place for them," he said. "Something about the wind." Ruth nodded. "I've been reading his journals," she said. "I'm starting to understand the whole system. The blizzard came on a Wednesday in late November, 2 days before Thanksgiving, dropping out of Canada with the particular brutality of a storm that has had a long flat run before it hits anything solid. The Weather Service had called for 6 to 8 inches. The Bighorn Basin received 22, with winds at 45 miles per hour, sustained and gusting to 61. 3 families in the county lost sections of roof. The Hendersons lost their hay barn. Every weather vane in the valley was stripped or destroyed in the first night of the storm, except for one. Ruth and the girls rode it out for 3 days. The furnace held. The cattle were in the barn with 2 weeks of hay. The north wall of the house, where the sunflower stalks stood packed with snow, ran 15 degrees warmer than the east wall throughout the storm. Ruth checked it with a thermometer the way Dale's journal had said to check it, noting the numbers in her composition book in the same methodical hand Dale had used for 30 years before her. She wrote Nov. 19, 9 am, north wall interior, 61F. East wall interior, 46F. Wind 48 MFE sustained. Monarch holding at medium. Firewood, adequate. Girls, fine. The girls were fine. They played cards at the kitchen table and read and helped with the cattle twice a day, bundled past recognition in layers. Following the barn rope Dale had strung every winter between the house and the barn door. The rope that was still there because Ruth had left it where he'd put it. Because she had read in his journal that it was not ornamental either. On the third morning, the wind had dropped enough to see across the yard, and the light off the snow was that sharp particular white that only comes after a storm clears completely, when the sky is a hard blue and nothing has walked in the field yet. Ruth stood at the kitchen window with a jar of sunflower oil in her hands. She had taken it down from the shelf the night before, just to hold something from last summer, and looked at the barn roof. The weather vane was still there, still turning. The sunflower petals Dale had bent at the tips to catch the wind were catching it now, spinning clean and steady in the post-storm air, and every other weather vane in the valley had been stripped or twisted flat by the first night of the blizzard. But this one had held. Lily appeared at Ruth's elbow in her wool socks and leaned against her mother's arm and looked at it too. Neither of them said anything. Then Lily said it stayed, and Ruth said yes, and that was the whole conversation. And then Ruth saw something that made her set down the jar of sunflower oil. Vic Brower was crossing the field from his place on foot through packed snow that came to his knee in places, and he was carrying a manila folder pressed against his chest with both arms. Ruth had known Vic Brower for 16 years. She had never seen him carry a folder. She had the door open before he reached the bottom porch step. He came in and set the folder on the kitchen table and stood beside it, the way you stand beside something you have been holding for too long and are finally putting down. "I should have brought this sooner," he said. "I didn't know about Pruitt until Agnes heard it at the church. Once I knew, I had to figure out how to do this right." He opened the folder himself. "Dale gave this to me in October, 2 weeks before. Inside was a document on Wyoming Land Trust letterhead, notarized, the county recorder's stamp in the lower right corner. A conservation easement, north field, sunflower beds, east fence buffer, 15 feet. 10 years, non-transferable. Signed Dale Robert McAllister. October 29th. The ink was the same blue as the ink in his composition books, the same pen he'd used for every season's worth of temperature readings and germination notes and frost dates. "He didn't tell me," Ruth said. "It wasn't a question. He told me." Vic's voice was steady. His hands weren't quite. "He said he'd been thinking about it for 2 years, and he'd finally done it. He said if anything ever happened, he wanted to make sure the land stayed land. He didn't want it cut up and sold off in pieces." A pause. "He asked me to hold on to it and make sure it got filed. I filed it the week after he signed it. It's been on record 14 months. Ruth read the document. She read it a second time, more slowly, the way you read something when you want to make sure you have understood the full shape of it before you say anything out loud. Pruitt's assessed valuation, his twice revised offers, the printout he had slid across this table with the practiced ease of a man who expected to be the only one in the room who understood the numbers. All of it had been built on the assumption that this land was available. It had not been available for 14 months. Every conversation that had traveled through Harmon's feed and the Lutheran back pew and Carol Jessup's kitchen about what Ruth McAllister could and couldn't manage had been about a situation that Dale had already addressed on a Tuesday afternoon in October at this table with a blue pen and his name. She put her hand flat on the signature. Then she looked up at Vic, who was watching her with the steady patience of a man who has been a good neighbor for 31 years and intends to keep being one. Outside, Cora and Lily were crossing the yard in their boots, heading for the barn without being asked, following the path they had packed down themselves over 3 mornings of the storm, solid enough now to walk on without sinking. Leon Pruitt came to the McAllister place the Saturday after Thanksgiving, this time with a man from his office and a printout of comparable sales, and found Vic and Agnes Brower sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with coffee. Agnes had spent 50 years in the Bighorn Basin and knew what a conservation easement meant in terms that required no translation. She explained it to Pruitt's colleague in the particular tone of a woman who has no interest in being misunderstood and considers precision a form of kindness. Pruitt listened to Agnes explain it. Then he picked up his printout. He looked at Ruth, standing by the wood stove with Dale's denim jacket over her chair, the jar of sunflower oil bright on the windowsill behind her, the weather vane turning above the barn in the clear, cold November sky. He said nothing, because there was nothing that would have improved his situation. He left. "He'll be back in 10 years, Agnes said, when the truck had gone down the drive. "Then in 10 years, I'll still be here," Ruth said. Cora put her head in from the mudroom. "Cattle are all in," she said. "Can we have lunch?" December came to the Bighorn Basin with the quiet that follows a hard storm. The particular piece of a landscape that has been tested and held. The sunflower stalks stood through most of it, gray and dry, before Ruth took them down in the last week of the month, leaving the root crowns to overwinter in the ground the way Dale's journal said to. So the plants would come back stronger in the spring from rootstock that had proved itself. The seeds from the strongest heads were in their envelopes in the cold drawer. The weather vane turned. The jar of sunflower oil went to the church potluck on Christmas Eve, pressed into a gift basket with the last of the squash and some bread Ruth and the girls had made. And someone who didn't know where it had come from said it was the best oil they'd ever tasted. Sometimes the ones who doubt you most are the ones who need your proof the most. Ruth McAllister planted sunflowers because Dale had planted them, and then she kept planting them because she read his journals and understood why. And then the blizzard came, and the proof arrived on its own, without argument, without permission. That is how it works with the things that are true. Has anyone ever underestimated what you were quietly building and then had to watch you finish it? If this story found you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who's being told they can't manage what they're managing just fine. Subscribe so you're there for the next one. At dusk on the first clear evening after the storm, Ruth stood at the fence and watched her daughters bring the cattle in, Cora at the back with a stick she didn't need, Lily at the gate counting them through, lips moving, and Vic and Agnes stood beside her without being asked, and the weather vane turned above the barn in the last of the light, and the day closed.